Okay, I'm Ilir Brasha from the University of Tirana. I'm making the doctoral degree here, and I'm analyzing the inflation inequality for the case of Albania, evidence from across income groups, age, and household typology for the years 2001-2025 that we have the available data. The aim of this research is to examine whether inflation differs across household types and to assess its impact on each group, meaning here different income groups, age groups of the head of the family, and household typology, meaning the number of members of the family for the Albanian case. Inflation is and has been every time an important topic, and we are one of the main topics of these days. It's inflation because of the war in Iran, and even our conference was made converted to online because of the war, and the inflation was everywhere present, but it impacted differently different household groups, and that's what we aim to see, not only for the Iran case this year, but to check the historical part of 2001-2025. In Albania, we are measuring inflation like in most of the other countries with CPI, Consumer Price Index, which reflects the average price changes of a fixed consumption basket for the overall population. From the Engels law, we know that the share of expenditure on necessities such as food and other necessities decreases as income increases. This brings us to an assumption, or gives us a thought that inflation varies across different household types, largely driven by differences in their incomes levels. Standard measures such as CPI or harmonized index consumer prices tend to underestimate price increases experienced by lower income households. And this is found in a lot of other research for other countries, because in Albania there was not done a study until now for this kind of research to understand how differently impacts the inflation each of the household groups, and policy decisions, and as in the other countries, including those by the Bank of Albania, are primarily based on aggregate inflation, often overlooking differences across different household groups. For instance, only for example, we in Albania make annually indexation for pensions based on the overall consumption price index, but this doesn't show the reality, because inflation for them is different from the overall inflation, as we will see in the following slide. Here are some of the other research. Most of the studies, like I said, show that low-income groups experience higher inflation compared to those of the higher income groups. So poorer people tend to experience a higher inflation compared to those of high income groups. And for example, there are some other studies, like in Armenia, that states that middle-income households experience the highest price increases over the years 2019-2025, where the middle income face 49% of cumulative inflation compared to 38% for low income and just 27% for high income families. In most of the other studies, the experience of the inflation is higher for low income groups compared to higher income groups. And the main reason is because of the Engels law, that low-income groups experience or share a higher of their expenditure, share of their expenditure on food and their necessities compared to the high-income groups. And aiming or knowing that experience, or from the experience that the inflation has been higher in this food category, we can suppose, or we know that the low-income groups experience the higher inflation. This comes also because, for example, for the EU countries, the impact of recent rise in inflation on low-income households from Enveligos and others states that low-income households tend to already buy cheaper varieties, and thus they are less able to buffer the impact of inflation through substitution, while high-income groups can substitute their high expensive products with cheaper alternatives. That's why inflation is more affordable for high-income households, because they can substitute their products anytime, choose to buy cheaper products, while low-income households consume a larger share of their income, save less, and are more liquidity constrained than high-income households. They therefore have less room to buffer sharp increases in their cost of living through savings. Mostly, like I said, for example, for 25 countries in EU during the period 2001-2015. For the low-income group households, for example, for the first quintile, inflation or like consumption bundles became 10.5 percentage points more expensive than those of the richest decile. Let's go to the Albanian case. We saw that the Engels law, which we said that share of expenditures on food and non-alcoholic beverages decreases with increases in income. And this is true for the case of Albania. As we can see here, poorest 25% share spend 53.8% of their expenditures on food and non-alcoholic beverages, while the richest 20% of them in the Albania share only or spend only 31.8% of their expenses on food and non-alcoholic beverages. Poorest 20% spend more than richest in the share of expenditures in rent, water, fuel, and power, and also communication, while the richest 20% spend more than other quintiles in clothing and footwear, in medical care, transport, recreation, culture, education service, hotels, coffee house, and restaurants, goods, and various services. So what we see here, poorest 20% spend more on necessities, and richest more on creativity and extra services. The methodology in this report to get the data, to get the results, the inflation by category for each quintile, for each household group, age group, and also household typology, is that we use the 12 main categories of products from Instat, our statistics institution in Albania, and the household budget survey. In Albania, it's used last base index to calculate the inflation. We have the weight of expenditure category for the 12 main categories per household group for 2007, 2009, 2014, up to 2019, but we don't have for the other period. What we have done to make a more realistic overview and to calculate better the inflation is that for 2008 and 2010 up to 2013, we have used linear interpolation to find the weights of each category. And for the years before 2007, we used the weights of 2007. And for the years after 2019, we used the weights of 2019 for the period 2020-2025. Then we calculated the index of each household group that we formulated. We calculated for the 12 categories as the sum of the weight of each category for each household group for each period times the index for each subcategory and each year. We have set the first quintile as the lowest income or poorest 20%, second quintile lower middle income, third quintile middle income, fourth quintile higher middle income, and fifth quintile highest income or richest 20%. Now let's go to the results where we have inflation inequality across household income groups in Albania for 2001-2025 using 2001 as the base year, consumer price index. As we clearly see from the graph, the poorest 20% experience the largest inflation during this time. The cumulative for 24 years is that the index for poorest 20% is 204.4, while for the richest 20% is 180.8. Meaning this, that the poorest 20% experienced almost 24 percentage points more expensive products or experienced more inflation compared to the highest 20%. Let's move to the same calculation, but with the base year 2019. As we see, so for this years, I calculated only this years because of the COVID crisis in 2020 and 2022, because of the aggression of Russia and Ukraine, which showed us high inflation rates during this period. And we see that the poorest 20% also during this time experienced the highest inflation. And for only 6 years calculated, they experienced almost 6 percentage points higher inflation compared to the richest 20%. Here are the inflation, not like indexes, but inflation in percentage over the year. And we can clearly see that poorest 20% during each year for 2019 to 2025 experienced high inflation, even in periods where the inflation was let's say stable, and also when we had high inflation as in 2022 or 2023. In 2019, we had, for example, for the poorest 20% experienced 2.2% inflation, while for the richest 20% experienced not inflation but deflation by 1 percentage points. In 2022, we can see that the poorest 20% experienced 8.6% inflation, while the richest 20% experienced only 7.2% inflation. We don't have a lot of differences in 2024, but as we can see, everywhere in each year, experience of inflation was higher for poorest 20% compared to richest 20%. Let's go now to the inflation inequality by age groups, meaning head of the household, with the base year 2021. And we can see that age groups with head of households over 75 years old experience higher inflation compared to those with lower age. Meaning, for example, head of households with head of household over 75 years old experience almost 8.3 percentage more inflation compared to those head of households from 25 to 34 years old. Going to household typology, we see that there are not so much differences like we saw in the income groups, but still there are some differences, some important differences. As we can see that single person household and 2 adults without children experience higher inflation compared to those people with children. Meaning, for example, single person household experienced 194.1 index of inflation, compared to single parent with dependent children, only 188.6, meaning there is like 6 percentage points difference between those in 24 years of the consideration. Now let's go to what impact of income group specific inflation on one of the ratios that is used to measure the inequality, which is S80s over S20s, which measures or calculates the revenue of the top 20 over top poorer 20. And we see for the case of 2017-2024 that inflation differs differently and reduces the change of this ratio. What we have done is that we have calculated the ratio, the real ratio, taking in consideration inflation by each income groups of the previous year, each year from the previous year. And we see that, for example, in 2023, the change in the S80s, S20s ratio would be 40.3% is smaller when accounting for inflation by income groups. In 2019, the change in the S80s and over S20s ratio would be 34.5% is smaller when considering income-specific group inflation. The smallest impact of income-specific inflation on this ratio is observed in 2024 at only 4%. But still, we have a lot of differences, especially in the income group, different income groups. And this is the first study in Albania that shows those differences and aims to take in consideration the specific inflation rates by each income group when we take political decisions, or the Bank of Albania makes decision about the future. And here are some of the most important references used in this study, but there are a lot of studies, like I said, that shows the different differences between not only income group but the household typology, like we did in the age groups for other countries. But for Albania, this is the first study, and we will have to go deeper in the future to find, or to go deeper not only in the 12 main categories, but to go deeper in each of the categories. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for